representative before, they might not actually have dealt with a lot of these forms. It's something that in a smaller estate, or where maybe somebody had like one or two accounts, there's fewer forms that they need to fill out. But if the estate has more, I guess, variety in its assets, and it's a little more complex, there's things that you need to be aware of. So welcome again. I'm attorney Justin Randall with Hooper Law Office. Our topic today, for those of you who are just joining me, is what personal representatives need to know about certain types of forms that they'll have to fill out, in relation to probate or claiming assets, things like that. So this is something that, depending on the complexity of the estate, is going to vary person by person, right? It's not always going to be all of these forms. It may be all of them. But if somebody has one or two accounts, you have been a personal representative before, you might not be dealing with the same level of paperwork that somebody else might be when there's a much larger variety of accounts. So before I go too in depth on that, though, just a reminder for people who are participating via Zoom, you can ask questions as I go through this. There's a Q&A function. So I will see those pop up and answer them as we go through this. Another reminder too is that at the end of this, you'll receive a feedback form that also gives you a place to mark down if you would like an initial consultation. Those are complimentary, so they don't cost you anything to come and talk to us, and we do usually schedule them for around 2 hours. Sometimes they don't take that long. Sometimes if the conversation is just so great, they take a little longer. But it's something that we really need to get to know your situation and know your family about a little better before we can give good recommendations. It's not as simple as asking a couple quick questions and figuring out the right answer. So it takes some time, but that's why we schedule them for around 2 hours and why they're complimentary. So usually by the end of those 2 hours, we can give you a pretty good idea of what we need to do. Or in this case, if it's you had a loved one pass away and you are the personal representative named in someone's will or the trustee of their trust, it's a very similar thing. You might come in and ask, well, what do I need to do? Where do I even begin? And that's what that initial meeting is really for, is to set you off on the right path in that case. So with that being said, the big thing that people are unaware of that I'll go into a little bit is what you actually need to do to act as a personal representative. It's not quite as simple as people think it is. So before I go too in depth on that, though, I'd like to actually list some of the documents or some of the forms that people would need to fill out, just to give you an idea of what you might see and what you need to do to go through these things. So really, a big one that comes up a lot is when somebody has life insurance, right? There's plenty of people out there that have life insurance. And speaking with one of our settlement paralegals, she was explaining that this is the most common form she sees people actually fill out, and those are claim forms for life insurance. So if you have been a personal representative in the past and all you really had to do was deal with a bank account, maybe checking account, maybe a couple of CDs or something like that, you may not have had to fill out a claim form before, or as a personal representative for claiming those life insurance proceeds for the estate or for the beneficiaries. So it depends on how that account was set up, whether that would be going to somebody's estate or directly to a beneficiary, but you may need to file that form. A big one that almost every state's going to have to deal with, or a state, excuse me, is going to have to deal with, is some form of tax, whether that is filing tax returns for the estate, getting a taxpayer ID number for the estate, making the proper election when it comes to how, IRAs are to be paid out, things like that, right? Those sorts of things can have pretty major tax implications, and some are mandated by law. It is a common misconception that once you're dead, you don't have to pay taxes anymore. Well, that's true, except for the year that you do pass away. You do still have to file one final tax return, and the estate does as well. So when someone passes away, you can no longer use your social security number as that taxpayer ID. So if you've never had to get a taxpayer ID before, that is not someone's social security number, it's a little unfamiliar to a lot of people. So if this is your first time as a personal representative, you might need some assistance figuring out how to do that. Another big thing that maybe somebody has dealt with in the past, or had someone else help them with, and so they don't have a lot of direct experience with it, might be dealing with real estate documents. Have you ever had to fill out an offer to purchase before? Have you ever had to get an appraisal for a property? There's a lot of these things that deal with valuations of real estate, or maximizing the value of real IRA accounts, so retirement accounts, that are really imperative for a personal representative to do to the best of their ability. Because once you're somebody's personal representative, or for those of you unfamiliar with that term, it's what people often refer to as an executor. That person has a duty now to the estate. So it's different than acting as someone's power of attorney for finance, for example, because you just have a duty to that person, right? Your duty is to represent them if need be, to do things for them for their benefit, pay bills on their behalf, manage the finances for them. But once you're somebody's personal representative, you're now acting on behalf of the entire estate, and you have a duty to the beneficiaries as well as that estate to maximize the value for them. So it's not as simple as just pay out that IRA, without looking into the types of elections you might need to make, or doing tax planning like with the estate, as well as getting appraisal for real estate. It's not as simple as using the tax bill, for example, because that may make it the easiest to do that, right? You're not going through that appraisal process, but the beneficiaries, they want the best value out of it. They want the fair value for the estate. So you have a duty to get the right appraisal as well. And so it's not always as simple as just, all right, this is what we're going to do. I'm the personal representative, so I'm making all the decisions. You have a duty to these people. So there's some responsibility that comes with that as well, and some potential liability if somebody isn't following the right procedures. There's also the ability, or the need to make notice to creditors as a personal representative for the estate. So this can be, sort of getting that newspaper notice out, right? And making notice to those creditors. And maybe you've never had to take out a newspaper ad before, and there's these forms that you need to deal with. So it can really help to have experienced individuals help you out with this. And that's where, somebody who only practices in the area of estate planning, trust settlement, probate, that's when they're going to be able to get you the best advice, because this is something that they deal with on a day-to-day basis, and something our firm, for example, deals with on a day-to-day basis. And one last thing I'll mention too is a lot of people aren't aware of is you do have to actually open what's called an estate account as a personal representative for the estate. So this is where you pay final expenses. This is where if there are administrative expenses for the estate, hiring the attorney, or dealing with, like property taxes while the home's being sold, whatever it might be, that's where those funds are supposed to come from. So because in the meantime, an individual's accounts that are going through probate are not necessarily available for all those things right away. So that opening that estate account can be very important. So the question becomes for a lot of people, well, how do we do this in the most efficient way possible? If you are someone's, both their personal representative and their power of attorney, is there anything you need to do first before you can start doing all these things? Or can you just, for example, take the power of attorney, or take the will down to the bank, or take both of them down and just start filling out the paperwork? And unfortunately, the answer is no to both of those. It's not quite that simple. So when someone is both the personal representative and the power of attorney for finance during the person's life, it's often confusing to them of, oh, well, I'm in both roles, so I should be able to continue acting without any sort of interruption. But a common misconception is that powers of attorney continue on even after someone's passed away. However, they actually, by law, end at death. So powers of attorney do end at death, and they do not extend beyond that point. So just because you were someone's financial power of attorney does not mean you are able to go down to the bank and start doing all of these things, paying all these bills as the personal representative. They'll say, well, you're telling me they passed away, so this means you're no longer the power of attorney, right? You can't use this document for that purpose anymore. So that's when people say, well, okay, I'm also named in the will, right? I'm named right here in this will. I'm the personal representative, so I should be able to act. Well, banks don't care what the will says, quite frankly. They will say, well, have you opened the probate? Have you actually been appointed as the personal representative? Have you gone through all the proper procedures? And can you prove that you were actually appointed in that role before they'll ever let you act as a personal representative? So what this generally includes is actually opening a probate account, or opening the probate with the court, filing the will, and then going through the proper steps to actually be approved by the court as that personal representative. It's not as simple as just being named in this document. Somebody is really making a very, very important suggestion, but a suggestion that you be named in that role. It is not an automatic approval by the court. So they first have to give people time to possibly object to that appointment if there's any reason to believe that the person is not fit for that role, or if the beneficiaries have any concerns. But if nobody does object and everyone signs off, it can be a pretty quick approval. Once they are approved, or if you are the personal representative, once you are approved in that position, you will receive from the court what's called a domiciliary letter. So this is really I sometimes refer to it as the sort of letter that you are who you say you are, and the proof that you are able to act as the personal representative, that you have been approved by the court, that you do have the authority that you say you do. So not only are there all of these forms that you have to be aware of, but there's also steps that you have to follow first before you can actually act and start filling out those forms. If you fill them out before you have authority, that's potentially invalid, right? And without that approval by the court, banks generally would just say, I would hope anyway, would just say, no, you have to come back with that domiciliary letter, on top of a death certificate, on top of, all of the other paperwork that they require in that instance, in order to actually act as a personal representative. So once that is done, and the probate has been opened, and there's a taxpayer ID for the estate, and all of that has been put in place, that's when you can start filling out a lot of these forms, including things like making claims for the life insurance, or giving the public notice to creditors, and making all of these forms available to yourself to fill out, right? You have to actually have that authority first. So this can obviously be a lot of things to handle all at once, especially if you haven't dealt with an estate before, or even if you have dealt with an estate before, but maybe it was a much simpler estate. You weren't dealing with a bunch of different accounts, a bunch of different forms to fill out. Maybe it was one or two bank accounts, right? Something very, very consolidated, something straightforward to handle for the most part. Or maybe what we hear a lot is, well, nothing ended up going through probate because there was beneficiary designations on everything, right? So in that case, there might not have been a lot for that person to actually handle account-wise as part of the estate, which can lead to its own issues, but that's a topic for another day, certainly. So when it comes to actually handling a lot of these accounts, you're not expected to know how to do this on your own. And the court, they try to give good advice on things like that, but this is really where it's important to hire or talk to, at least initially, a good estate planning attorney, somebody who only focuses in that area and only deals with this area of law in terms of probate and trust administration as well, because they will have the experience to help walk you through these things. Especially, I sort of joke that our settlement paralegal, Valerie, knows these forms better than I do when it comes to, the exact way to fill them out properly to get the court to quickly approve them through and things like that, because she deals with it on a day-to-day basis. So that experience is invaluable in terms of making this run as smoothly as possible, and also making sure that you have the proper steps followed, because it is an extra, I guess responsibility is a good way of putting it. It's an extra responsibility acting as a personal representative. It's not really just a formality that somebody fulfills to get the estate moving along. There's a lot that actually needs to be done in order to make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that the estate is maximized. The value of it is as maximized as possible, so that somebody can actually, there's no claims that money was wasted in the administration, that, there wasn't any sort of, undue spending, something that was just egregious in terms of an expense. because the duty of the personal representative is to get things running as smoothly as possible and make sure that the estate, what each beneficiary receives, is as large as it possibly can be. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that every expense, no matter how big, is going to be deemed sort of unreasonable. There are large reasonable expenses too, but that's where having that professional guide you is say, look, this is a very common expense. This is something that would absolutely be approved by the court if it was ever questioned. That's where that guidance comes in. This is not something that somebody would be expected to know how to do all the time. Or if they've dealt with it once even before, right? I mean, a lot of times people come in having dealt with a probate or a trust settlement, and maybe they either didn't really follow all of the procedures they should have, or it was a very simple estate and didn't require as much guidance in terms of the forms to fill out and how best to maximize the value of the estate. So when I guess a couple other forms too that as a personal representative you will need to be aware of is, I mentioned tax returns, right? So there's not only the final tax return for the individual that you would need to file, but also the final tax return for the estate itself. So in case there was ever, sometimes probates can last longer than a year. And so you might go into another tax year, right, where maybe there was growth on an account during that time, and there does have to be a final tax return still filed because of the new taxpayer ID opened up, right, for the estate. So then once all of that is settled, once all of the distributions have occurred and, all the creditors have been satisfied, or they didn't make their claims when they had their window to make their claims, then you can close the estate at the end. And there's a lot in between opening and closing, obviously. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of different forms that you might have to fill out. And these forms are unfortunately not uniform across every company either, right? Sometimes one company's forms look different than another company's forms. And unfortunately, there's no real way around that other than hopefully the person working with you has worked with those companies before too. And the longer you do this, the more likely you are that you've dealt with the vast majority of these companies, right? So with that, it's a little shorter of a topic today, but a couple of things that you'll be receiving from us as well. So the material we're handing out, or handing out electronically anyway, is a sort of what happens when something goes through probate and what happens with non-probate assets, and kind of the difference of that process for the, what may happen versus what you may expect to happen versus what actually does happen. So there's a lot of misconceptions about when something is beneficiary designated, for example, but they have a will, what happens with that, or how are expenses paid, and what happens when something is going through probate in terms of paying expenses and what doesn't. And then just as a reminder, our next webinar as well is so it's on June 30th, and it will be covering, I believe, the wills versus trusts. Yep. So wills versus trusts will help guide you to, if you are considering setting up your own estate plan, or you are maybe named as a trustee or personal representative, for example, in your parents' plan or in a family member's plan, what exactly it is that you have to, what the proper procedures are for those roles, and also what's the real difference between how those documents work. That's a really common question we get, is how do wills work versus how do trusts work? What's the difference? What one's right for me? And that's what we'll talk about coming up next Wednesday. So with that, I'm not seeing any questions. So if you do have any questions, just remember, you can always fill out that feedback form and then set up a time to talk about, talk with one of us for that complimentary initial consultation. I guess with that, if you fill that out and you set it up, we'll see you soon. Otherwise, we will see you guys next week for our next topic.